Hey, good morning, everyone in U.S. History 2. I thought I'd do a quick review of the things that I think are most significant from Chapter 21, World War I and its aftermath. You have to remember this is a U.S. history class, so we have to at least segue somewhat into the European theater to talk about the causes of World War I on some degree, but we're not going to get in great detail on the whole uh, system of allegiances and why they created a vacuum or a tilting of powers to suggest that that might be a prelude to war. The other causal factors like colonialism and or the arms race, but all of those things are factors that go into why World War One started outside of the context of the U.S. The U.S. did not start as an active participant in the First World War until it was well underway for 3 years, actually almost into a state of stalemate, if you will. But the classic storyline is that as Kaiser Wilhelm was pushing Germany to become a much more significant world power, both in terms of armament, especially in terms of the Navy, and actually a land army, he was creating a change in the power structure in Europe. And that change in power structure meant some of the other countries in the regions were seen as being under threat. And so different allegiances shifted and changed, and the arms race and the race for imperialist uh, possessions throughout the world arguably was going to lead to conflict. And fear of that conflict led to further allegiances with other nations, creating basically uh, friends and foes, if you will. Some call it the Central Powers, and the Central Powers were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, which was extremely weak at that time. Sometimes they call that the sick man of Europe, the Balkan area down into the Southern European theater. And those that tried to counter that new great strength of Germany would be initially France and Russia. Great Britain tried to stay neutral for a period of time, and it was successful, but its allegiance would evaporate, or its neutrality would evaporate fairly quickly, and have to realize that the balance of power suggested they should be in allegiance with France and with Russia to curtail this ever-growing juggernaut of power, which was Germany. What's interesting about Great Britain, a lot of people don't know this, or I think is a bit of a trivia pursuit question. Queen Victoria, the Queen of England at the time, her grandson is Kaiser Wilhelm. And people don't know that, but back in the era, there was a long history of royal families doing intermarriage to keep the peace and to create alliances throughout Europe. So that was an interesting phenomenon. Just before the outbreak of World War I, within the few years preceding it, Kaiser Wilhelm would often visit his grandmother in England and visit the Royal Navy, which was very, very jealous of, and it gave him impetus when he came to power to create a much more powerful military and to compete with the other European nations in colonial conquests. And that created a great deal of tension, no question about it. Um, in fact, if you really want to study World War One in a much bigger picture, Kaiser Wilhelm was actually pushing to create an allegiance between Germany and England for the longest period of time. It only broke down when basically the shifting of powers was seen that England couldn't possibly do that. It was felt more threatened than aided, if you will, by a German English alliance. So at the early onset of the war, Germany starts off by um, uh, well, we know there's a powder keg in the Balkans. It's a classic story. There's a political vacuum down there. Serbia is in play. There's some Serbian nationalists that want to create independence. There's those that want to keep their strength under the the Austrian-Hungary Empire. And we know an assassin kills Arch Ferdinand and his wife. That is the powder keg that sets off the initial war. There's certain claims for that Serbia was supposed to make amends, and there was demands put on them. They couldn't meet all the demands in the momentary, or the time that it was demanded of them, and there was some miscommunication, arguably, between the nations. But the war whoop and the war sort of momentum was just too strong to avoid, and we know the war breaks out in the Balkans initially. But then we know Great Britain or Germany feels like it's best to attack Great Britain through Belgium, so it attacks Belgium first. Belgium's a neutral allied with Great Britain, and therefore Great Britain enters the war begrudgingly as a result of Belgium being attacked by Germany. We know because France is being attacked. Russia's going to come in. Russia was going to come in anyways because Russia always saw itself as a protectorate of the Serbian Empire. And so, basically it's World War I in Europe, in the European theater. The United States really did come out strong initially as a neutral, didn't want any part of this. It was a foreign affair. Our country was thriving economically. We were now producing, if not equal, certainly more than Germany, France, and Great Britain combined in terms of industrial output. Our economy is growing, our standard of living is growing. For many Americans we know are suffering as well. This is the progressive era, but things are changing, and unions are starting to get recognized, and the standard of living for everyday laborers is actually starting to improve. And we are also a country of immigrants. We have immigrants from every one of the participating nations in World War I. We have, and the Italians were also part of the allegiance. They never really get involved to the degree that Germany had hoped. But all of these countries are at war in World War I. We have English, and we have German, we have Polish. Polish is part of the Austro-Hungary Empire at that time. We have Russian immigrants. We have Slavic immigrants from that area as well. So all of these people arguably are going to feel a sense of anxiety and concern about getting into a European event that might put basically ethnic identities at risk. And in fact, that's one of the backdrops of World War I that's a negative, is when World War I broke out and we joined the Allies, what we call the Allies later, Great Britain, Russia, and France. We know that many people that were of German heritage and those that were Austro-Hungary heritage were often under great suspicion, and anybody that spoke out against the war, the Italians or Italian immigrants, there was a huge backlash against Italian immigrants in German immigrants, and as well as Austro-Hungary immigrants. It was really, really sad. In fact, many civilians that were of traditional English stock, for lack of a better way of saying it, were often recruited to spy on their neighbors, and it put a real chilling effect on free speech. We know people that spoke out against the war would be considered unpatriotic, and many of them were actually jailed under the Sedition Act of 1917. But anyways, this is the prelude to war, why we get in it. It's initially we're trying to stay the hell out of it. Woodrow Wilson fights for most of his first administration just to keep out of World War I. We know as he runs for re-election in 1916, what's his logo? His logo is he kept you out of war. Within a year of his re-election, we are in the war. But there was already some telltale signs that we would be. Germany, in order to defend against the supplying of the war effort of the Allies, Great Britain, Russia, and France, were benefiting by the trade with the United States. So Germany was curtailing or trying to stop that kind of trade endeavor by sinking American shipping. And we know one of the famous ones was the Lusitania, which was actually a luxury ship, arguably. Some say it was carrying munitions secretly, but over 100 civilians died. That started creating a war whip against Germany. And we know trade with the Axis powers was minimal, while trade, lending of money, support economically and in armament and in raw materials was growing by threefold to the British, the French, and the Russians. So there's no question we're already vested economically in the Allied powers, and the result of German sort of undermining of our merchant and our trade, basically sinking ships, often many of them not American, but nonetheless it was our merchandise that was going over, started creating a huge deal of animosity. That was obviously maybe the tipping point, was the unrestricted U-boat warfare by the Germans, but it was also the Zimmermann telegram. Ironically, Germany actually tries to egg on Mexico to go to war with the United States, and they would help Mexico recapture Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, lands they lost in the 19th century, and they would be able to recapture that. Ironically, the Germans sent this through Western Union, a simple telegram that was sent actually through the London offices. It was easily encrypted, decodified, and we saw what it said. And what did, probably because I think Wilson was already leaning to entering the war, and many other Americans were too, in favor of the Allies, some propaganda was pushed out. The Zimmermann telegraph was revealed to the public. And so the public is starting to push heavily towards entering the war on behalf of Great Britain, France, and Russia. And we do. We declared war in 1917. We were hoping it would be a fairly quick war, but we knew from the fact that it was actually stalemated by the time we entered, we hoped that we would be the tipping point and maybe it would end fairly quickly. But there's something phenomenon that happens right at the same time. Russia collapses. Russia collapses in its war effort against Germany, both because of the cost of human life and treasure, but also the Bolshevik Revolution occurs. The Great Revolution of 1970, basically Russia folds. It's out of the war. They're going to work on their internal problems. They sign an armistice with Germany. What does allow Germany to do? Have a one-front war. Now they can just basically go after Great Britain and France. Ironically, at the same time we get in. So there's almost a race to enter into the war as Germany is able to recruit its strength, having Russia out of it. We know that we mobilized very quickly. It never had a very popular conception of a standing military in high strength numbers since the colonial revolutionary days. We didn't like that. So we had a very small military, had a pretty decent sized Navy because of Teddy Roosevelt's impetus on that. But in terms of a standing military army and, modern tank, modern for World War I, and the like was lacking. But we really made the war effort a national effort, and it became significant. And we were over there in large numbers, certainly by the fall of 1917, and the war ends fairly quickly. When was the armistice ultimately signed? We thought it would go a lot longer, but Germany realized it was going to lose. And instead of basically letting people enter into the German homeland, they declared peace on before the armistice, spring of 1918. Just looking for the Treaty of Versailles. It ends in November 11th. I should know that we celebrate November 11th to this day for Veterans Day. The ending of the war that will end all wars, and we know that's not the ultimate treaty. And one of the reasons why it's not true is the peace is ill constructed. What do I mean by that? We have a very idealistic president by the name of Woodrow Wilson who pushes this beautifully idealistic idea. And I know when I was a young student, I don't know if I was in high school, probably not, because I didn't really get my interest in history and really learning stuff just to learn it until college. But I remember he had this thing called the 14 points, because there was an argument that it was because of the United States involvement that the war was successfully brought to an end in favor of the Allies, that we should have a large say in it. Woodrow Wilson was the first sitting president to ever leave the United States physically, and he went over to France and helped negotiate this peace. And he had this very idealistic view that we're going to create basically a world of civility, and we're going to create countries that are their sovereignty, their power is going to be basically derived by that country, not from outside influences. It's going to be this idealistic, beautiful vision, and it was going to be under something called the League of Nations, and it had a 14 points. When I look back at it as a young person, I thought it was the most beautifully written, concept for world peace and world autonomy for all countries and an identity for all nations to live with one another. When conflict broke out, it would be resolved not through arms, but through dialogue and through process that was civil in nature. But he was a bit mocked by many of the foreign leaders, and I think it was the French Prime Minister George Clemenceau remarked, "The good Lord only had 10 points," meaning the 10 commandments. And so Wilson was a bit mocked in European theater as being a little bit overbroad, maybe a bit Pollyannish about the possibility of creating this world organization to keep the world peace and make sure everyone does everything the right way and lives with a moral standard of self-governance and autonomy for all nations and respect for all nations. It really doesn't take place nearly as well as he wants it. And the huge irony of it is, guess which country doesn't sign on? Ours truly. The United States of America, when the League of Nations and the 14 points were pitched, because remember, all treaties with foreign nations have to be approved by the United States Senate. And those of you that like local politics, a guy by the name of Henry Cabot Lodge, a United States Senator from Massachusetts, opposed it. And I used to really hate Henry Cabot Lodge because of that, because I thought it was very narrow-minded not to look for this altruistic method by which we can kind of have world peace and the way we can deal with conflict through, I don't know, scholarship and through, scientific modes of inquiry and fairness. I was a bit naive. And so the reason why Henry Cabot Lodge didn't want to go for it wasn't because he was a jerk, which was I thought when I was younger. On a more deeper analysis was we would be giving up a lot of our nation's power to this tribunal called the League of Nations. And the argument was, why would we ever want to give up our own autonomy and sovereignty to this sort of collective entity when that collective entity might rule against us or be harmful in its outlook or determination in terms of American policy? So Henry Cabot Lodge, our own Massachusetts senator, really rallied other United States senators to not support the League of Nations and the 14 points. And we never did. We never endorsed it. And it died there. And we know his son became Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who ran against John F. Kennedy for the United States Senate seat here in Massachusetts. And John F. Kennedy upset him, although he actually worked for John F. Kennedy in his administration later on. I'm way off point, but I think the whole history of the lodges here in Massachusetts is fascinating. In fact, the son, after losing to John F. Kennedy for the United States Senate, runs as Richard Nixon's running mate in the election of 1960. Anyways, way off track. So we know we enter the war. We are, I think, significantly responsible for helping win it for the Allies. But the ultimate peace treaty with Versailles had deep flaws in it. One is that the United States, although had 58 sovereign nations sign up, the United States was not one of them. But more importantly, the way in which Germany was treated, and maybe rightly so. I mean, they were the aggressors. They were the one that was probably responsible more than any other nation for starting World War I. And there's multiple causes behind it, but they, there was a huge impetus with their actions on why the war started. It was unbelievable reparations. I mean, you're going to pay back for what you did. France really wanted, so did England, wanted a lot of reparations. And it was so incredibly burdensome. In much of the Rhineland area, basically the buffer areas between Belgium, France, and Germany, were taken away from the German nation, and maybe rightly so. I'm not going to argue that, but the point is Germany comes away very, very embittered. In a peace that doesn't really bring peace is largely to lead to future problems. And the economic ripple effect of World War I will be felt fairly shortly thereafter, within 10 years. A lot of people think the Great Depression was the stock market. The stock market's a symbol or a symptom of the Great Depression. But the Great Depression was a worldwide event, largely brought about by the cost and the ripple effect of what occurred in World War I. But I always find it fascinating, the whole 14 points. If you ever get an opportunity to take world history or history of World War I itself, I used to read the proposed United Nations and the 14 points is this like brilliant doc, but then I get a little wiser and realize that it was very difficult to implement such a thing. Aftermath of World War I, we know that much of the Middle East, a lot of people think, well, they were divided based upon ethnic makeup and or historical boundaries, but it was basically split up between European powers as protectorates. I think France got Syria, and we know Great Britain gets Iraq and Jordan. The United States doesn't want, we were offered sections of it, we didn't want any of that. We didn't want to get too involved in foreign entanglements. But one of the aftermaths of World War I is really the carving up of the Middle East in an array that might not benefit stability for the long run. And we know the revolution, socialist revolution, communist revolution, scared the hell out of the Western world, especially the United States. And so there was a Red Scare that really developed here in the United States. And we know the Red Scare was basically anything that was promoting or agitating for socialist concepts or ideas of concepts, or certainly communism as well. And we know the famous Sacco and Vanzetti trial. I believe there's still a nice whole presentation about it in the John Adams Courthouse right up in Boston, where the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts sits. Sacco and Vanzetti were Italian immigrants. They probably were radicals. They probably were anarchists. But the evidence of them doing, I believe it was a bombing, it doesn't give enough information here in the book, But these guys were tried on very, very skeptical evidence. They weren't represented fairly. The judge really railroaded them through the process. They were convicted and ultimately executed. Probably not as much for crimes, but more so for being Italian immigrants that had radical ideas. Radicalism was being squashed in our nation. In fact, guys like Eugene Debs that spoke out, he's a labor leader, but he spoke out against World War I. You're considered a traitor to your nation if you vent ideas that are inconsistent with so-called all-American values. And that's one of the negatives of any time we seem to get into war, is voices of dissent, voices of the contrary view often not only get condemned, but the actors are punished as a result for holding those views. And it's a very un-American concept, but it's a historical, cyclical process that we get into. We know that we had our own racial tensions that developed significantly. Many African Americans served in World War I, not necessarily in direct fighting regiments, but they served nonetheless. And when they came back after visiting Europe and European ideals as being very different structured in terms of their societies, they came back demanding their rights. And it was called the hot summer of 1918 and into 1919, and these Chicago riots were, it's called the Red Summer, I'm sorry, 1919 is the Red Summer. There was violence in all major cities throughout the United States over race relations, because now there was a pushback, and it was a very sad part of American history, but it's part of the civil rights movement, this kind of rioting over racial tensions and, well, discrimination, quite frankly. It's bound to ultimately simmer to the surface when people make sacrifices along with their neighbors and don't get treated the same as they are when they make the same sacrifices and efforts to be Americans, and they weren't. But the Red Summer of 1919, there's a lot of interesting history there. A lot of people don't study it, and I wish the book went in a little greater detail, because it's really fascinating how we think we have racial tension today. Well, it's recurring themes, and it becomes somewhat cyclical depending on other catalytic factors. Like in 1919 was basically the closure of World War I, gave rise to a simmering boil, if you will, to racial inequalities that were happening throughout the country. But that's pretty much it in a nutshell. But the thing I liked, one of the closing sentences in the thing, is I'm a big believer in dissent being allowed. And I tend to think of myself as kind of a moderate conservative, but I notice that when people are in the minority view, and I don't mean minorities being black, Hispanic, or of one of the small. I don't mean smaller in terms of lesser face, but lesser in terms of the volume of those people in the nation. That boy, when we are in a situation of war or in a situation of fear, we do tend to be very, very narrow-minded as a people. And I like this sentence here that captures it quite well. It says, by whipping up nationalist passions, American attitudes towards radicalism, dissent, and immigration were poisoned. In fact, I have a friend of mine. His parents, I think, were born here, or they were little kids when they came here, Italians. I don't want to say his last name, but he's in his 70s now, and he's a very close friend of mine. And his house was broken into recently, and he doesn't have an appropriate gun safe, but his guns weren't stolen, so he asked me to store his guns. I have a gun safe. And he gave me a pistol from the 1915 or something like that. And I don't want to, it was a derogatory term, but let's call it the Italian Protector. And he had a different name for it, but he called it the Italian Protector. So what's this? He goes, my grandfather used to carry this in the late 19 teens and 1920s. I said, why? And, he's a bit of a historian himself, although he's an engineer, but he loves history. He studies it. He goes, the animosity towards Italian immigrants during the time was so great that he was constantly fearful of being attacked or robbed or shot. And why this came about was largely because of the nationalistic fever that we got into because of war. And when we're at war with a nation, we often nationalize the makeup of the people from those countries. And because we're a nation of immigrants, it often gets reflected in the way we treat people of certain DNA heritage. And it's really sad. Unfortunately, I have the gun downstairs in my safe. It's not worth anything other than nostalgia, if you ask me, because that's a really piece of crap. But it's very, very interesting about how a nation that often says we're fighting for democracy, but yet at home we struggle with creating equity and a sense of tolerance towards people that are different from us. And it's a recurring theme we have throughout history. little preachy today. Sorry, but I want to get up there. I put up 2 very good videos. They're fantastic. They're only 5 or 6 minutes long. I apologize for these long videos, but it's really, really good. It doesn't get too deep into the cause of World War I, but it gets deeper to why the United States got to World War I. And I think that's what you mostly want to know from this chapter. Otherwise, be well, and don't be afraid to reach out and ask questions or raise concerns as we go.